Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen, and enjoy my stories every day. It was the ordinary details that I once loved about Jenna that first seemed off, little things that stuck out like slivers from the warm timber of our life together. 14 years, and I thought I knew her. We'd met in our 20s, and she had this fire in her that I admired, a charm that made her the center of any room without effort. To me, she was magnetic, someone I trusted in a way I couldn't explain, the kind of woman who was both partner and best friend. But now, looking back, I could see the way her magnetism was shifting in ways that unsettled me. One Thursday evening, as I pulled into the driveway after a long day, I noticed her car parked in an odd way. It was slightly angled, the headlights left on, and her usual meticulous neatness was conspicuously absent. She always insisted on parking perfectly, lining up the front bumper with a slight crack in the driveway. Her precision had been one of those endearing quirks, something that I'd loved about her. Seeing the car out of place struck me like a warning bell, as if a small alarm was going off somewhere in the back of my mind. When I walked inside, Jenna was nowhere to be seen, but her phone sat on the kitchen counter, buzzing softly. Normally, she was cautious with her phone, keeping it tucked into her purse or pocket. That night, though, it was just there, screen up and glowing. My gut told me to look, but I hesitated. What if it was nothing? After all, we'd built a life together, a house, a routine, even a few businesses. But in that moment, all I could focus on was the glow of the screen, like it was calling out to me, begging me to look closer. I glanced around, half hoping she'd show up and save me from crossing a line I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. But the house was silent, and the glow persisted. I walked over, picked up the phone, and with a shaking hand, unlocked it. I knew her password, of course I did. We'd been together for over a decade, and privacy was never something we'd really worried about before. But this was different. This felt wrong. The message that had illuminated the screen was from someone named Greg, and it wasn't a casual greeting. Thinking of last night. Can't wait for more. My stomach dropped as I read it, and for a moment, I felt like the world had tilted on its axis. My mind raced, grasping for excuses, explanations, any shred of rationale that might make this something innocent. Maybe he was a friend, a business partner. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. But then, another message popped up, a photo of them together at a cafe. She was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years, her head tilted close to his. It was an intimacy that felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I put the phone down, my hand numb and my mind blank. It was as if my brain had short-circuited, unable to process what I'd just seen. That night, I lay in bed beside her, feeling like there was an invisible wall between us. Jenna was oblivious, sleeping peacefully while I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying the messages over and over again. A part of me wanted to shake her awake, to demand an explanation right then and there. But another part, the part that had built a life with her, clung to the hope that this could somehow be fixed. That maybe, just maybe, I was misunderstanding something. In the following days, I became hyper-aware of every interaction between us. I started noticing things I'd brushed off before, the way she'd suddenly taken to staying out late, her newfound obsession with her appearance, the way she laughed a little too hard at her phone. My mind went to dark places, and I hated myself for it. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband, the kind who snoops and accuses without evidence. But the messages kept replaying in my mind, and no matter how much I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. One Friday evening, a few days after finding the messages, she came home late. I was sitting on the couch, pretending to watch TV, but really, I was waiting for her. She walked in, her face flushed, and a hint of perfume trailed after her, something expensive, something she'd never worn before. I watched as she moved around the room, avoiding my gaze, her eyes flicking everywhere but at me. It was like she knew, somehow, that I was on to her. Late night? I asked casually, keeping my voice steady. She nodded, setting down her purse. "Yeah, sorry. Work ran late." Her answer was so quick, so rehearsed, that it took me aback. She'd never been a good liar, but tonight, she was unnaturally smooth, as if she'd practiced this line in her head a dozen times. "Must have been a tough day." I forced a smile, trying to hide the bitterness creeping into my voice. She didn't respond, just offered a vague smile before heading upstairs. As she disappeared up the stairs, I felt a cold fury building inside me. I wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation, to lay it all out and make her tell me the truth. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the realization that I wasn't ready to hear what she had to say. Whatever it was, I stayed silent, letting her lie pass unchallenged. The following weekend, I decided to confront her without actually confronting her. I'd heard about a family gathering, Jenna's side, a casual get-together at her sister's house. It was the perfect opportunity. I knew Greg would be there, he was apparently a friend of Jenna's sister, and that's how they'd met. I'd learned this after a little online digging and a few well-placed questions to her family. When we arrived at the gathering, I spotted Greg almost immediately. He was standing near the drinks table, laughing and chatting with some of the other guests. Jenna's face lit up when she saw him, and in that moment, I felt like an outsider in my own life. She walked over to him, a small smile playing on her lips, and for a second, it was as if I didn't exist. I joined them, plastering on a friendly smile as I introduced myself to Greg. He looked a little startled, clearly not expecting to meet me, but he recovered quickly, offering a hand and a smooth, practiced smile. "Nice to meet you," he said, his eyes flicking to Jenna as if looking for reassurance. "Likewise," I replied, gripping his hand just a little too tightly. I watched his face closely, noting the flicker of discomfort that crossed his features. For a moment, I thought about calling him out right there, exposing everything in front of everyone. But instead, I played the part of the oblivious husband, the trusting fool who had no idea what was really going on. As the night went on, I watched them closely. They were careful, keeping a polite distance, but I saw the stolen glances, the way her laughter was just a bit too loud, her touches just a bit too familiar. And with each moment, my resolve hardened. I wasn't going to let this slide. But I wasn't going to blow up in front of everyone, either. When we got home, Jenna went to bed without a word, exhausted from the evening. I stayed up, my mind racing as I planned my next move. I wasn't going to be the fool anymore. I was going to take control, to show her that she'd underestimated me, that I wasn't the clueless husband she'd taken me for. The pieces were all in place, and soon, she'd see just how far I was willing to go to set things right. The days that followed that family gathering were some of the longest of my life. I went about my days with Jenna as if nothing had changed, but inside, I was a ticking bomb. I couldn't believe the nerve of her, how she'd laughed and joked with Greg in front of me, right there with our family around. It felt surreal, like I'd stepped out of my life and was watching someone else's, observing my own misery from the outside. But I kept quiet. I waited. I decided to learn everything I could about Greg, the man who had been playing with my life behind my back. I dug into his social media profiles, scrolling through photos of him at happy hours, hiking trails, and fancy dinners. He was younger than Jenna by a few years, with that cocky confidence of a guy who thought he was invincible. His life looked glossy, polished, all smiles. I wondered if his friends and family had any clue who he really was, if they knew he was willing to tear a marriage apart just for a thrill. One night, after Jenna went to bed, I pulled out my laptop and started combing through our bank accounts. Jenna had her own accounts for work and spending, something we'd always agreed on to keep a little independence. She'd never been one to spend excessively, but I wanted to see if she'd left a trail. I found nothing too suspicious at first, a couple of high-end restaurants, some charges for boutiques that she usually shopped at. But then I noticed one of those charges was for a restaurant 2 towns over, a place neither of us had ever been. The charge was from a night she'd claimed to be working late. My heart pounded as I kept scrolling, seeing more and more things that didn't add up. The next day, I left work early. I couldn't focus on anything except getting closer to the truth. I decided to pay a visit to her sister, Karen, under the guise of dropping off some things Jenna had left at home. Karen was a smart woman, someone I'd always respected. She and Jenna were close, but I thought that if Karen knew anything, she'd have the decency to tell me, even if it meant going against her sister. I hoped she might give me some insight into what Jenna had been doing, or at least confirm whether she'd seen Jenna and Greg together. When I arrived, Karen welcomed me in with a warm smile. We chatted for a bit, catching up on family gossip, and then I shifted the conversation. You know, I began, trying to sound casual, Jenna's been so busy with work these days. She's even been going out to eat with some colleagues after hours, making new connections and all that. Must be stressful for her. Karen looked a bit surprised but nodded. Yeah, I think she mentioned going out once or twice, but I don't think it's that often. She's never really been one to hang out with work people. Well, except Greg, but that's because he's such a big talker, right? I forced a smile. Oh, yeah. Greg. I pretended to laugh, though the sound came out hollow. She talks about him a lot, actually. Do you know him well? Karen gave a slight shrug. He's been at a couple of family events here and there. She met him through work, and he's a friend of mine too. He's interesting, you could say. Her voice trailed off a little, as if she wasn't completely sure what to make of him. Interesting how? I pressed, trying to keep my tone light. Well, Jenna told me he's one of those people who always knows what to say to make you feel like the most important person in the room. Charismatic, you know. I think she likes the attention. He's probably harmless. She paused, glancing at me as if trying to read my expression. You don't think he's, I don't know, crossing any boundaries, do you? I shook my head, giving a dismissive chuckle, but inside, I was fuming. Harmless. Greg was anything but harmless. He was a leech, a snake worming his way into my life and taking everything I held dear. But there was no point in blowing up at Karen, so I played along. No, of course not, I said, forcing a smile. Just curious. I guess I don't get to see much of her outside work, so I was wondering how she spends her time with these new friends. As I left Karen's place, I felt a pang of sympathy for her. She was just as clueless as I'd been. Maybe she had her suspicions, but she didn't know the truth. Not yet. Back home, I thought over my options. I knew I couldn't let this go on much longer. Every time I saw Jenna's phone light up with a text, every time she came home late, I could feel my anger simmering just beneath the surface, like a volcano about to erupt. But I wanted my revenge to be something she'd never see coming, something she'd feel every day for the rest of her life. I wanted her to know exactly how much she'd underestimated me. That night, I finally decided to confront her, but not in the way she might expect. I'd make her feel safe, make her think I was none the wiser. And then, I'd strike. When she walked in the door that evening, I was in the kitchen, cooking her favorite meal. She looked surprised, her eyes flicking between the dinner setup and me. "What's all this?" she asked, a smile tugging at her lips. "Just thought we could have a nice evening in," I replied, giving her a warm smile. "It's been a while since we had dinner together, just the two of us." She seemed pleased, but there was a hint of hesitation in her eyes, like she wasn't sure if this was a gesture of love or if I was somehow onto her. I poured her a glass of wine, watching as she took a sip, relaxing a little as the evening went on. Over dinner, I kept the conversation light, talking about work, our friends, and some memories from the early days of our marriage. She laughed, her guard slipping just enough that I could almost see the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But the warmth I felt was fleeting, quickly replaced by the anger simmering just beneath my facade. "So," I said casually, as I refilled her glass, I heard from Karen that you and Greg have been spending a lot of time together." Her hand froze, just for a second, before she quickly recovered, lifting the glass to her lips. "Oh, yeah. Just work stuff. He's a new client, so I've been showing him the ropes." "Must be nice to have someone to talk to outside of work hours," I replied, keeping my tone light, though each word felt like a carefully placed trap. She nodded, her smile a little too tight. "Yeah, I guess so. It's been helpful for work." I watched her closely, looking for any sign of guilt, any crack in the armor she'd carefully constructed. She was good, I had to give her that. But she wasn't perfect. A faint blush crept up her neck, a small twitch at the corner of her mouth when she forced herself to keep smiling. As we finished dinner, I leaned back in my chair, watching her with a carefully blank expression. "You know, it's funny. Sometimes I feel like we're strangers, living separate lives in the same house." She looked down, fidgeting with her napkin, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of remorse. But she quickly masked it, lifting her head to meet my gaze. "Don't be silly. We're just both busy with work. You know how it is." I nodded, keeping my voice steady. "Sure, I know how it is." The next morning, I decided to make a bold move. I knew that Greg would be at the gym around the corner. Jenna had casually mentioned it once, back when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I walked in, pretending to just be there for a workout, and spotted him almost immediately. He was alone, lifting weights with that smug look of confidence I'd grown to despise. I approached him, extending a hand. "Hey, Greg, right? I'm Jenna's husband." He looked startled, his eyes flicking to the side as if searching for an escape route. But he took my hand, giving me a firm shake. "Oh, yeah. Good to meet you." "Likewise," I replied, keeping my tone friendly. "She talks about you a lot. Seems like you two have a good working relationship." He gave a stiff smile, clearly uncomfortable. "Yeah, we work together sometimes. She's great. Really dedicated." "Oh, she is," I agreed, my smile not reaching my eyes. "She's very dedicated. I appreciate the company you keep her. Makes me feel less guilty about my own work hours, you know." Greg's face tightened, and for a second, I thought he might say something. But he just nodded, muttering an excuse about finishing his set before he turned away. As I left the gym, I felt a rush of satisfaction. I could see the panic in his eyes, the realization that he was suddenly out of his depth. He'd thought I was clueless, just a husband too wrapped up in his own life to notice anything amiss. But now, he knew better. He'd been put on notice. I'd planted the first seed of doubt, and now all I had to do was sit back and watch it grow. The conversation with Greg at the gym had sparked something inside me, a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. I could tell he was rattled, his composed facade cracking in a way that told me he wasn't used to being confronted. He thought he'd gotten away with it, that he was above suspicion, and that Jenna and I were living separate lives with no overlap between him and me. I wanted him to feel that fear, to second-guess every move, to wonder what I'd say or do next. I had no intention of giving him or Jenna any peace. After that day, I made sure Greg felt my presence wherever he went. It wasn't anything direct, just subtle reminders that I knew who he was. A few days later, I ran into him again, this time at a coffee shop near Jenna's office. I wasn't there by accident, of course. I made sure to stand right behind him in line, close enough that he'd feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Greg, right?" I said, giving him a pat on the shoulder, feigning surprise. "Didn't expect to run into you here. Guess we have more in common than just Jenna." He gave me a weak smile, glancing nervously around the coffee shop. "Yeah, just grabbing some coffee before work." His voice was tight, and I could see his discomfort, the stiffness in his shoulders. Great choice, I said, my tone casual, almost friendly. It's Jenna's favorite spot, too. She must have mentioned it to you. He looked down, avoiding my eyes, mumbling something about needing to get to work. I just smiled and let him go, watching as he practically sprinted out of the cafe. It was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. He was falling apart at the edges, and I knew that soon enough, Jenna would be too. At home, I kept up the act with Jenna, pretending that everything was fine, letting her think she was still fooling me. I'd play the doting husband when she came home late, asking if she'd had a good time at work, if her project with Greg was coming along. She'd respond with her usual excuses, her voice tinged with a faint note of guilt she tried to hide. But she had no idea that I was chipping away at the life she thought she was building behind my back. One evening, as I was sitting on the couch, Jenna came downstairs dressed up. She was wearing a new dress I'd never seen before, her hair perfectly styled. She gave me a quick smile, the kind you give someone when you're trying to hide something. Heading out again? I asked, keeping my tone light. Yeah, she said, her voice a little too breezy. There's a big presentation tomorrow, and Greg and I need to go over the final details. Of course, I replied, my eyes locked on hers. You two are quite the team. For a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, guilt, maybe, or fear. But she covered it quickly, giving me a small smile before heading out. I watched her leave, the door closing with a soft click, and waited a few moments before grabbing my keys. I followed her that night. I'd already suspected they were meeting somewhere more private, and I had to see it with my own eyes. I drove a few blocks behind her, my headlights off, watching as she pulled into the parking lot of a small, upscale hotel on the edge of town. She didn't hesitate, didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. She parked, checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, and then stepped out, walking toward the entrance with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. I stayed in my car, the anger rising within me as I watched her disappear inside. It was one thing to suspect, but to see it, that was something else entirely. I felt a flash of rage, a desire to storm in after her, to confront her and Greg both. But I kept my cool, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. This wasn't the moment. I had to be patient. When I returned home, I sat in the dark, waiting for her to come back. Hours passed, the house silent around me, until finally, close to midnight, I heard her key in the lock. She slipped inside quietly, thinking I was asleep, and headed upstairs without a word. I waited a few minutes before joining her, slipping into bed beside her, the scent of a different cologne lingering faintly in the air. She turned to me, her eyes tired, but she offered me a sleepy smile. Long night? I asked, my voice soft, almost kind. She nodded, yawning. Yeah, just a lot of work to get through. I didn't reply, just lay there, feeling the weight of the silence between us. She'd built her life on lies, and soon enough, they'd come crashing down around her. Over the next few days, I set my final plan in motion. I gathered everything I needed, texts, emails, bank records, even the photos I'd taken of her meeting Greg at the hotel. It was a carefully curated collection of evidence, each piece fitting together perfectly. I wanted her to see the full scope of her betrayal, to know that I hadn't missed a single detail. And then I'd take it all away. Every piece of security, every illusion of control she thought she had over our life, would crumble in front of her. Finally, the night came. I waited until she came home from yet another late night at work, her smile a little too forced as she greeted me. I led her into the living room, my expression calm, almost friendly, and gestured for her to sit down. She looked a bit puzzled, but she obliged, sitting across from me as I pulled out the folder of evidence and set it on the table between us. "What's this?" she asked, her voice shaky as her eyes flicked to the folder. "Open it," I replied, keeping my tone even. "I think it's time we talked." Her hands trembled as she reached for the folder, her face paling as she flipped through the pages. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, her mouth opening and closing as if she was struggling to find words. But I didn't give her the chance. "You lied to me," I said, my voice low, steady. "You betrayed me. And for what? For someone who doesn't even have the decency to face me like a man." "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," I cut her off. "I've watched you, Jenna. I've seen every lie, every excuse, every time you chose him over me." Tears filled her eyes as she stared at me, her face crumbling as the weight of her betrayal settled over her. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, her voice choked. "I don't even know why, it just happened." "Just happened?" I laughed bitterly. "You didn't think I'd find out, did you? You thought I'd just sit back, clueless, while you played house with him." She shook her head, her hands twisting in her lap as she tried to hold herself together. I thought maybe we could work through it, that we'd find a way to fix things." "Fix things?" I stood, unable to sit any longer, my anger boiling over. "You destroyed everything, Jenna. You tore apart our life, our trust, for what? Some cheap thrill?" She looked away, silent, her face streaked with tears. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction seeing her like this, watching as she finally understood the depth of what she'd done. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice cold. "You're going to pack your things and leave. You can take whatever you want, but I want you out of my life. Out of my home. Out of everything we built together." She looked up, her eyes pleading, a glimmer of hope in her expression. "Please, can we try to make this work? I know I've made mistakes, but I still love you. I can change." I stared at her, feeling a mixture of anger and pity. "You've already made your choice, Jenna. You chose him, over and over again. There's nothing left here for you to fix." As I spoke, I could see the realization settling in, the weight of what she'd lost finally sinking in. She tried to argue, to beg, but I held firm, my resolve unbreakable. I'd made my decision, and there was no going back. The next day, she packed her things and left, her face pale and drawn as she walked out the door. I watched her go, feeling a strange sense of relief, a freedom I hadn't felt in years. I'd taken control of my life back, reclaimed everything she'd tried to steal from me with her lies and deceit. As I closed the door behind her, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain, I was finally free. After Jenna left, the house was almost eerily quiet. At first, the silence felt like peace, like the kind of calm I'd been yearning for during those last turbulent weeks. I threw myself into work, took on new projects, and picked up a couple of hobbies I'd let slide. But no matter how many tasks I piled up, each night felt heavier than the last. I tried to convince myself that it was just the adjustment period, that I'd been wrapped up in Jenna for so long that it was natural to feel a void. But it wasn't just an adjustment. It was as if, in stripping away the lies and betrayal, I'd also stripped away the pieces of myself that had once made me whole. Days turned into weeks, and the numbness set in, creeping up slowly until it colored every moment. People around me noticed, the coworkers who had seen me joke around and bring energy into every room, the friends who'd come over for poker nights and shared laughs. They all began asking, "You okay, man?" with concerned eyes and forced smiles. I brushed it off, saying I was fine, just dealing with the fallout of a long marriage gone wrong. But I wasn't fine. One day, as I was sorting through a drawer, looking for some tax documents, I came across a box of photos. Inside were snapshots of Jenna and me from over the years, beach vacations, family gatherings, Christmases spent curled up by the fire. I should have thrown them out, erased every reminder of her, but something held me back. I thumbed through them, each photo like a glimpse into a life I'd almost forgotten, a life where we'd been happy, or at least happy enough to fool ourselves. My mind drifted to the first time I'd told her I loved her. It was the middle of the night, after a drive through the mountains that had stretched on for hours. We'd pulled over by the lake, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars flicker in the inky black sky. I'd taken her hand, looked into her eyes, and said those 3 words with more conviction than I'd ever felt in my life. And she'd smiled, her eyes sparkling with the same conviction, and told me she loved me too. I sat there in the empty room, staring at that memory, and realized with a sickening weight that I didn't know who I was without her. Jenna had betrayed me, but the years, the history, the life we'd built, those things still held me prisoner. In a moment of desperation, I called her, my heart racing as the line rang. I don't know what I expected, a fight, maybe, or her refusing to pick up. But she answered, her voice sounding distant, as if she'd been expecting this call too. "Hello. It's me," I said, barely recognizing the tightness in my own voice. There was a long pause, a static crackle over the line, before she replied. "Why are you calling, Mark?" "I don't know," I admitted, and the words sounded hollow even to me. "Maybe I just needed to hear your voice." Her sigh was soft, almost wistful. "I know this is hard, but we have to move on. It's what we both need, isn't it?" "I thought it would be easier," I said, the bitterness slipping into my voice. "I thought once you were gone, once the lies were gone, I'd feel better." "Then why don't you?" she asked gently. I opened my mouth to answer, but I didn't know what to say. It wasn't anger or revenge that filled me now, it was something I couldn't name, something that sat heavy in my chest, like grief but darker. "I just can't shake it," I finally said, almost whispering. "All these years, everything we were, it doesn't just go away. Even if it was broken, it was still us." The silence stretched on, an unspoken understanding settling between us, the remnants of a bond that still held, even if by the faintest thread. "Maybe," she replied quietly, "maybe it's time we stopped pretending we were ever okay. Maybe we were just holding each other up because we didn't know how to stand on our own." The call ended with no goodbyes, and for the first time in months, I felt tears in my eyes, thick and hot, welling up from a place I hadn't let myself acknowledge. She was right. We'd been broken for years, but I'd never wanted to admit it. That night, I dreamed of her, vivid, disjointed images of moments I'd forgotten. Her laugh as we danced around the kitchen, the way she'd tuck her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. I woke up gasping, the ache in my chest sharper than ever, as if those memories had carved out pieces of me I couldn't get back. Days passed, and that strange hollowness settled deeper into me, becoming a part of my routine. I went through the motions, smiled when I was supposed to, laughed at jokes I didn't find funny. But each night, I felt the weight return, pressing down on me until I couldn't breathe. Then, one cold, gray morning, I received a call that froze the blood in my veins. "Is this Mark Hansen?" a voice asked. "Yes, who's calling?" "This is Dr. Fry from the City General Hospital," the voice replied, calm and steady. "I'm sorry to inform you that Jenna was brought in this morning after an accident. She was in critical condition but, she didn't make it." My heart stopped, the words echoing in my mind, disjointed and unreal. Jenna. Gone. Just like that, in an instant. It didn't make sense. We hadn't spoken since that last call, hadn't seen each other. There was no closure, no goodbye, just the sudden void that filled my entire world. The next days were a blur of phone calls, funeral arrangements, condolences from people I hadn't spoken to in years. I attended her service, standing at the back of the church, barely able to keep myself upright as they spoke about her life, her spirit, the person she had been. And all I could think of were the words I hadn't said, the things I'd never resolved, the hollow emptiness that consumed me. After the service, I stayed behind, watching as the last of the mourners drifted away. I knelt by her grave, the silence around me heavier than any I'd ever known. I whispered the things I'd never been able to say, apologies mixed with anger, love tangled with regret. The wind rustled through the trees, a soft, hollow sound, and in that moment, I felt as if I'd been erased, as if every piece of who I was had been tied to her, to the life we'd once shared. And now, with her gone, I was nothing. As I walked away from the cemetery, the ache inside me sharpened, the weight settling like a permanent shadow. I'd thought I'd won, that I'd taken back control of my life. But in the end, Jenna had taken more from me than I'd ever realized. Her betrayal had shattered me, but it was her absence that left me hollow, adrift, a stranger in my own life. The silence followed me home, and in that quiet, I finally understood the true cost of revenge. I had freed myself from her lies, but in doing so, I'd also severed the only ties I'd ever known. Now, alone in a house full of memories, I realized that some battles, no matter how justified, leave only ruin in their wake. To the floor, lost in the quiet, irrevocable sadness of what could never be undone.